service at the University of California, San Francisco. I'm now with a group called the Glaucoma Center of San Francisco. I'm a co-research director, obviously a clinician as well. And I'm here to talk to you about, why is there more glaucoma among Asians? And my proposal would be that it's really related mostly to the anatomy. Before I get started, I want to thank Chris Leung. I guess he's basically everybody's boss here, right? Chris is everybody's boss. And I've known Chris probably longer than any of you, obviously. So probably over 15 years when he was a junior faculty, a rising star. And ever since then, ever since I've known him, he's been a very nice, fair and supportive individual. We're talking about you, Chris. And even through the years, and now he's obviously a big shot in all of your bosses. And I still think that he's a very gentle person. Everyone I've talked to, including junior to him, have said that Chris is somebody who, he never shows any anger. He doesn't show any disapproval or anything like that. Maybe if you look carefully, there will be just the very hint of a facial change in expression, but that's probably about it. So if there's ever an opportunity where you see Chris raise his voice, or that he actually directly expresses disapproval, then my guess is that you really screwed up. And my official recommendation to you would be to probably apologize immediately and say that you'll never do it again. But the truth is that you're very lucky to have Chris as your boss, having known him for somewhere between 15 to 20 years. And it's not always that way, having been part of different academic institutions and being in leadership positions. Chris is a rather unique person, so I hope all of you appreciate that.
It's actually quite unusual and quite strange to actually having the speaker introducing me instead of me introducing the speaker. But I think we all are honored and privileged today to have Professor Shan speaking with us. Professor Shan, actually, as what he has described, has been around the field for a long time. He was born in Taiwan, and then he moved to the U.S. to study medicine, and then and earned his fellowship in UCSF before becoming a faculty there. He also is a former Executive Vice President for the World Glaucoma Association, which is a big organization overlooking events, organizing activities around the world for glaucoma education and research. And Professor Lin is an expert in many things. Glaucoma obviously is his special area that he spent many years working on it. I'm sure you have come across Ocular Hypertension Treatment Study. Rachel, Rachel and I just are working on a 5-year prospective study looking into Chinese population patients with high intraocular pressure without glaucoma damage, overlooking how we're able to identify patients at risk for treatment, because we don't yet actually have a good way, even though we learn a lot from the Ocular Hypertension Treatment Study. And Professor Lin is a PI for that study. So we can, the look doesn't fit with the the seniority. I mean, as I said, Professor Lin has been around for a long time, although he looked very young, but he's also very, very senior in the area. So we are very, very fortunate to have him to talk with us today.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you. That's very generous. Well, I'm glad to see so many young faces, and I hope you at least know the basis of glaucoma so that you can give me some feedback, and I will give you, in a way, an argument for why there is more glaucoma among Asians. And I want you to think about that. And there's probably other reasons obviously more reasons that I'm talking about. There's going to be genetic reasons and possibly other environmental reasons that we don't even know some of the causes of glaucoma. But I want you to challenge me after the end and also think about what I've talked about, because again, this is a perspective based largely on my research, as you'll see. In the U.S., we always give our financial disclosures. They're really not relevant here. We're not. It's not to promote a product. I've had research support from some of the devices. In fact, Chris and I collaborate. So one of the companies at the bottom there is Tomei, which has supported us with research support and device support. So that's a little bit of disclosure. Really, none of these are really relevant to this talk. And really, the only disclosure that's relevant to this talk is that I'm Asian, and so I have a personal, perspective on this. I have a strong family history of glaucoma. Being Asian, as I'm going to tell you, is also a high risk for developing glaucoma for various reasons. And myopia, I'm about a -9 in my refraction. For those of you who are ophthalmologists or budding ophthalmologists, or even if you're researchers, I would bet that most of you are probably myopic. And if you somehow are not myopic and you're an ophthalmologist, somehow you got through the screening system and still became an ophthalmologist, because it's almost required to be myopic to get into our field. So a little bit of background. Glaucoma is obviously a very prominent disease. And if you look at these prediction models, and this is from one of the researchers who's here in Hong Kong, actually, who looked at predictive models of glaucoma. The reason I've labeled Asia on that top line is that it's increasing. So as this is predictive all the way out to 2040, so we're in between 2025 and 2030, and you can see the rates of increase. Now, some of that is due to Asia having the largest population of any of these continents, right? But also the aging population. But I will also argue that Asians overall get more glaucoma than whites, and we're having a predilection for glaucoma for some of the reasons that I'll tell you about. Most of them anatomic related. Again, this is a perspective, and I'm making in a way an argument, and I'd like your thoughts and your creative thinking about this. So these are relatively facts here, that Asians in general have more glaucoma. I've shown you that in terms of just sheer numbers, but also relative to especially Caucasians. The predominance of glaucoma has been towards normal tension glaucoma, which is even harder to treat or harder to diagnose than standard high tension glaucoma. It's not simply that you measure the pressure, and if it's over 20, then the patient has glaucoma. This is a very tough disease to diagnose and then to treat. And there's more angle closure glaucoma, which is definitely, related to the anatomy, as we'll see in a minute. And I think for the future, I'm going to argue that myopia is going to be the really big change, as we see, or already taking place. There's so much myopia in the Asian populations that this is going to become maybe the major risk factor for glaucoma in the future. So as an outline of what my perspective is about, why there's so much glaucoma among Asians, is that here are the major areas that are anatomic risk factors. They extend all the way from the cornea, related to its thickness, anterior chamber and the angle, the iris thickness, the optic disc. So toward the back, we're talking about differences in the optic disc that put Asians at higher risk. And the overall issue of myopia, which is a anatomic risk factor. Why am I myopic? Why do I have these thick glasses? And most of you are either in contacts or glasses because your eyes are too long, longer than normal than considered, hemetropia. Here's sort of visually, so you can, rather than just all the words I'm saying, here's visually all the differences among Asians that we'll go through and that I will tell you are going to be risk factors for why you are developing or we are higher risk for glaucoma. All the way from the cornea to deeper the anterior chamber, the iris and its dynamics, the angle narrowness, which again, it's already well known that Asians have more narrow closed angle glaucoma, all the way stretching back to the optic disc. Asians are different in that respect as well, and ultimately we have more, at least in urban areas, more myopia, and that's axial length related. We're going to start with the anatomy, the anterior segment anatomy, because I want to tackle angle closure glaucoma, which is so prominent among Asians. In the white populations, it's almost non-existent, whereas in the Asian population, some studies have shown it's half of the glaucoma. And the populations that I'll tell you about are these populations, East Asian populations, and I have the benefit of having a large number of these patients in my area in San Francisco. And we'll talk a little bit about that, but we'll focus in from the US first. So these are the populations that I've studied And these are also all the major East Asian populations that you see from the US Census here. And so I'll make a couple points. So these are almost all of the Asian populations, except for the American, or for the Asian-Indian population that's considered more South Asian. And the largest Asian population in the US, if you're curious, is ethnic Chinese. That's not surprising. Filipinos are actually coming up as third here, but the truth is that the recent 2020 census actually shows Filipinos are second, and actually almost exceeding and will exceed the Chinese as the most prominent Asian population. So we have Filipino studies. As I understand it, there's a significant Filipino population here in Hong Kong, right? Taiwan also has that, and I think U.S., as I mentioned, you know, it's going to be, if not already, the largest Asian population in the U.S., probably because of the easy immigration, you know, situation with the Philippines. And so we'll talk a little bit about the Filipino eye, so to speak, that puts them at higher risk, and whether it's higher risk than, say, the Chinese population. I will also just point out to you, if you're interested in U.S. population, if you look at 2020 or 2000, 2010, 2020, you see this very strong jump, almost exponential jumps in the Asian population. So the Asian population in the U.S. is growing percentage-wise the largest, you know, by its sheer proportion of the population. The largest by numbers is the Hispanic population, but as you'll see, you know, we recently have a new president. That may change with immigration policies going forward. I'm lucky, I'm in San Francisco. There's a lot of Asians, and here you're looking at the local census population. You go from 2000, where it's about 30%, and then it goes to 33% in 2010, and then basically in 2020, we're almost at 40%. And at this point, we're probably about 40% Asian. And it's reflected in my patients. That is, when I go to clinic, about half of my patients are basically ethnically Chinese. But I also have a large number of other populations, also other populations in terms of Caucasians, Hispanics, and African Americans. So we can therefore look at those different populations to compare why Asians are more at risk for glaucoma. And I'm going to start with closed angle glaucoma. And for those of you who are on the student level, you know, this is the area where the fluid goes out. And so you see on the left there an open angle. The trabecular meshwork is that little meshwork right in the corner there where fluid has to go through and get back to Schlemm's canal, back to the bloodstream. Closed angle glaucoma is not hard to understand. That plumbing system where the fluid goes out is closed up. And so Asians, especially East Asians, are very high risk of that. Again, almost half of our glaucoma is this type of closed angle glaucoma, and we are very high risk for that. Why is that, though? And it's not simply just genetics, but there's anatomy associated with this. This is the device. I don't think you have it anymore, Chris. This is an older device, but we started these studies, you know, decades ago. So this was and we still have this one actually, even at my new clinic, as that it's anterior segment. It's dedicated to anterior segment imaging, anterior segment OCT, called the Visante OCT. And Chris and I are collaborating now with the Cassia, which is sort of the latest generation spectral domain OCT, higher resolution, three-dimensional imaging. These are the type of parameters that you can look at with anterior segment imaging. The parameters will go through. This is a lot of detail for you, but basically we're focused on the angle. As you see on the right there, that dark area is where the fluid needs to get access to and then leave the eye, you know, in order to, you know, maintain a normal pressure. Well, if that area is more narrow or crowded or closed, then that's a problem. That will lead to higher pressures and glaucoma. And these are measures such as these open, you know, angle opening distance. 750 refers to the distance in microns from the very, you know, from the scleral spur. And that's basically the distance of the trabecular meshwork where the fluid has to sort of percolate through or filter through. So that area is the most critical area. We have measures about how open the angle is, how thick the iris is, and we're going to talk about those differences going forward. And I'll keep it on that level. I know there's a lot of information, but this is just that overlaid on a real anterior segment OCT of the eye, real image of the eye. So these are the measures that now can also be automated. In fact, Chris's group has helped it develop automated ways of looking at our three-dimensional OCT, so we don't have to manually go in there necessarily to measure all of these. That's how we did it before. So we have thousands of images. As you can imagine, my medical students and my team were working very hard, sometimes late into the night, assessing all of these images. We did a study that, this is the first study I'll tell you about, where this was decades ago, where we looked at Chinese versus the white. And we actually had collaborators in southern China and Guangzhou, Zhongshan Ophthalmic Center was our, was a source of the Southern Chinese patients. We also had a collaborator up in Beijing University. So we were interested in whether there was differences in Northern and Southern Chinese. We also had Chinese Americans, that would be my clinic, as well as Caucasians. And I think that's going to be the most interesting area of where the data is. You'll see that I basically presented as Chinese compared to Caucasians or whites, because actually when we compared mainland Chinese or Chinese Americans, North or South of mainland Chinese, all the values were basically the same. So there were no differences really in ocular anatomy between, let's say, Southern Chinese and Northern Chinese, at least in our study. And we did all these measurements, UBM, the anterior segment OCT, as we talked about, because we wanted to understand what the risk factors were and what the differences are in those different groups. I will show you visually what all of these mean, but they are reflections of the space where the fluid goes out, the anterior chamber depth, which is the entire sort of space, the anterior chamber width. So one is how high it is and one is how wide it is, and are there differences between racial groups. The lens vault, how much the lens sort of sticks forward, determines that space, and how thick the iris is one of the walls of the angle. And then are there changes between light and dark? Those are actually, I think, some of the most interesting aspects that are different between racial groups. And finally, the anterior chamber area. This is one of my former fellows. She's now over on faculty at USC, who came to us from Guangzhou, China. So she actually collected most of the data when she was there, came over here to be a fellow with us, and then collected most of the data, if not all of the data, and did all the UBM testing and scanning and gathering of the data for our Chinese Americans and white Americans. So again, we had a total of about 500 subjects. Pretty good number. These were people without glaucoma, by the way. We didn't want it to be biased by people who have glaucoma. And here are some of the findings. And I think they'll be relevant to all of you, being probably mostly of ethnic Chinese ancestry, is that how are our eyes different? Well, here are some basic differences. Our anterior chamber depth, so the front of our eyes, that depth, that sort of line from A to B, is smaller after you adjust for gender and age and the length of the eye. So it's not due to, we have longer eyes or shorter eyes necessarily, but just if you adjust for all of that, we still have a more crowded anterior chamber, and the width is smaller too. And so I make the joke that when I was growing up as a kid in the U.S., one of the things is you look at Chinese people or ethnic Chinese people, and you have small beady eyes. We do have small beady eyes, actually, in some ways, compared to Caucasians. So the front of our eyes is the area of what we call might be, visually would be the iris that we see, the anterior chamber width, is smaller. So that leads to a crowded situation. So no surprise that that whole area that you see in white there is smaller, which is the area basically of those two factors than the Caucasians. Our iris thickness, our iris is thicker than Caucasians. People who have more pigmented irises, and those of you in this room, unless there's somebody Caucasian, is we all have a pigmented iris. And the higher your more pigmented you are, basically you have a thicker iris. So we are thicker than Caucasians, and that leads to one of the walls being thicker. So part of that angle, if one of them's thicker, then the angle is going to be more crowded. So that is thicker, and the area of it is greater in Chinese. This is probably a very interesting, maybe the most interesting aspect of our data, is that we looked at the dynamic change. And because when you are existing in the world and those different lighting or your different focus when you're looking at your computer, your iris, your pupil will change and your iris will thicken up, especially if it's dilated, and it will crowd that angle. So in fact, angle closure or attacks of angle closure happen typically at night because it crowds that angle. So that thickening going from the light environment to a dark environment is greater in Chinese, which is against us. It's not only do we have a thicker iris, it crowds up and thickens up more in the ethnic Chinese. And finally, you won't be surprised that the angle is smaller in Chinese. And so we are predisposed to this angle closure glaucoma just by our anatomy. And so this is sort of a summary. Our anterior chamber width, depth, the height, and then the width is smaller, the area is smaller, the iris is thicker, which accounts for it. The dynamic change in the iris goes against us, and basically our angles are more narrow. So we're set up for this angle closure glaucoma, unfortunately. And the bottom line is all that crowdedness causes us to have more angle closure. Plateau iris is not a term probably most of you know unless you're an ophthalmologist, is that plateau iris is probably the second leading cause of the angle closure glaucoma. Pupillary block is the #1 cause, where there's fluid is blocked at the pupil and the iris is pushed forward. Here, the plateau iris is an anatomic condition where usually it's related to, you see the picture there, the ciliary body behind the iris is either large, anteriorly rotated, and the iris may insert differently on it, and that there's no space between it, and it pushes the iris up. You have almost like a balloon behind the iris pushing the angle up. And we theorized whether Chinese had more of that. Turns out not. So you look at those numbers and they look about the same. There was no statistical difference between Chinese and whites as the cause. But if you had plateau iris, if you're Chinese, you also had a narrow angle, and that makes sense as well. And how about in the Japanese population? Well, in the Japanese population, the majority of their glaucoma is normal tension glaucoma. We're going to touch on that too, because that's the other side of the coin, or that's the other type of glaucoma that happens much more in Asian populations. It's in some cultures like the Japanese, as you can see, of their open angle glaucoma, almost all of it is normal tension glaucoma. To give you a reference, in African Americans and whites in the US, these are US studies, about 25% of their glaucoma is normal tension glaucoma. Most of it is where it's high pressures. So you can use high pressures as a major screening tool. But in let's say in Japan, being in below 21 as the pressure does not guarantee at all that you don't have glaucoma. Most of it is where it is below 21. And so angle closure glaucoma was actually relatively small in this Tajimi study, which is close to Tokyo. And I do want to point out, though, that myopia is a key factor as to why there was so little angle closure glaucoma. Because when you look at another study from Japan, I'll talk about that later, where they didn't have as much myopia. Basically, emmetropia was the average refraction. They had much more angle closure glaucoma, and they are also at risk for this disease. So when we looked at Japanese Americans, just to again compare with Caucasians, are Japanese more at risk for angle closure? What's the reason for that? We do know that they are more at risk, and so we had almost a population-based study. We had the clinic-based study from two of my colleagues who are Japanese Americans, and they had lots of Japanese patients. So over 1,700 patients. And the vast majority of the glaucoma was normal tension glaucoma. But there was a fair amount of angle closure glaucoma too, and some of those pie slices that you see there, about 10 to 15% can be angle closure glaucoma. And one of our fellows who's from Japan, now back in Juntendo University in Tokyo as a faculty member, we compared that to the Japanese population, both to the Chinese ethnicity as well as Caucasian. I circled all the areas that are statistically significant. So there's some minor differences with Chinese, but for the most part, very similar in terms of all these parameters. When you look at the comparison with Caucasians, similar to what the Chinese comparison was with Caucasians. That is, almost all those factors were different, all leading to more angle closure. Smaller eye, smaller anterior segment, iris is thicker. And so this is no surprise, and the summary is very similar to the Chinese comparison to Caucasians. A narrow angle, iris thicker, and a greater lens vault, so everything's sort of more crowded from the lens sticking more forward. One difference with Chinese that might put them at lower risk is the anterior chamber width was greater in Japanese compared to Chinese. So they didn't have such a small width, horizontally. How about the Korean population? Most of the glaucoma in the Korean population is also normal tension glaucoma, very similar to the Japanese population, where almost all of their open angle glaucoma is normal tension. But they also have a relatively high rate of angle closure when you look at their rural populations where they do not have as much myopia. Again, the myopia will be my sort of closing argument, you will say. And again, I think it relates to all of you because I think most of you have myopia as one of your diseases or one of your health conditions. Dr. Ki-ho Park is maybe one of the best known folks in Korea in terms of glaucoma at Seoul National University. We did a collaborative study, and we looked at the data for, that we obtained, same machine. We actually sent one of our residents over to get some of the same people to collect some of this data. And again, very little difference compared to Chinese. When you compare to Caucasians, almost all of the values were different. And you look at the iris values, and they're almost different. There are some differences with Chinese, but those are relatively minor in absolute values. And again, almost all the values were different in terms of anterior chamber parameters and iris thickness. And hey, this is one of my fellows in Korea who's a chair over at Korea University who worked on some of this as well. And basically, again, the same story that compared to Caucasians, Koreans also have this sort of narrower angle, their iris is thicker, their anterior chamber is smaller. They did have something that was relatively protective, and maybe that's why we don't see as much angle closure, is that they had a smaller lens vault. Their lens doesn't stick as forward as much, even compared to Chinese. And so maybe relative to even Chinese, they have less angle closure glaucoma. A lot of open, normal tension glaucoma, of course. And then the Filipino population, which brings it a little bit closer to home, because I think, again, walking around the city, talking with my colleagues and friends here, there's a fair amount of Filipino population just because they've come here to work, right? So you will see, I'm sure, many of those in your clinic. We have a lot of Filipinos in the Bay Area, in San Francisco Bay Area. I circled this because this is the map of that area, and we've circled Daly City, which is just the town next to us in San Francisco. And the joke slide next to it is that it's labeled Little Manila because more than half the population is Filipino. And even within San Francisco, there's a pretty significant Filipino population. And I'm telling you this because we borrowed the patients from my colleagues in Daly City and in Vallejo, which is in the North Bay Area. And so they also have a very large Filipino population. And my student who worked on this, this was done so long ago, he is now faculty at one of the Midwest universities, a cornea faculty, but he is Filipino American. So he had a vested interest in studying this, and it was perfect. He wanted to study this population. When he looked at almost a population-based study, but a clinic-based study with our colleagues who have a lot of Filipino patients, over 1,000 patients. So he did a lot of hard work going through all those charts. And what he found compared to Caucasians is there was more glaucoma in Filipinos, almost twice the rate of glaucoma. And the proportion of glaucoma that was angle closure, 8%, as opposed to 0% in Caucasians, as I said, is very uncommon in whites. And so that was a little surprising that there wasn't more angle closure. If you look at a Chinese population, for example, you would expect maybe 25% of the glaucoma to be angle closure glaucoma, or maybe higher. The interesting finding, too, was that the proportion of glaucoma that was normal tension glaucoma was about 50% of the open angle glaucoma, as opposed to Caucasians, which it was 27%. And that doesn't surprise me. As I said, in the Baltimore eye study of whites and African Americans, the normal tension glaucoma is about 25% of it. So more normal tension glaucoma in the Filipinos, more angle closure glaucoma in the Filipinos compared to whites. And when we looked, and this is one of my former Filipino fellows who's back in the Philippines as a faculty member, and she did this study looking at the OCT findings. And this slide just kind of jumps through them, so you won't see it all together. But the differences with Chinese were very minor, but almost all of the values compared to Caucasians were different. And these are, again, the iris and the angle findings. And there's no surprise. They have a narrow angle, they have a thicker iris, the smaller anterior chamber, and something that was a little protective and maybe explains why there's less angle closure in Filipinos than Chinese, is that they had a smaller lens vault. And so, again, a little bit similar to the Korean population as well. And I'm going to end with talking about the Vietnamese American population and give you a little story of our Bay Area as well. This is one of my colleagues who is a good friend, Ngoc Nguyen. She's Vietnamese, and she's in San Jose. So San Jose is the southern sort of tip of the Bay Area, about an hour from San Francisco. And San Jose has the largest Vietnamese population outside of Vietnam. And so almost all of her patients are Vietnamese, probably because she's Vietnamese, but there's a large population. So one of my fellows, you see Dr. Peng there, who's now back in Taiwan as a faculty member, did all this work, during her year, collecting all this data on Vietnamese, over 2,000. And what she found was interesting. It's a little different from the story I told you about Japanese and Koreans and Filipinos. A lot of angle closure, so about half of the glaucoma was directly primary angle closure glaucoma or combined mechanism glaucoma. The other half was open angle glaucoma. And what we found, this is one of my fellows who did this study and wrote up the paper for American Journal of Ophthalmology, is when you compared the Vietnamese, they had changes that were in the direction you would think compared to whites, but also they were also significantly different compared to Chinese in a direction that is actually higher risk for angle closure glaucoma. So I know that these are some p-values and coefficients, but if you trust me, the values for the angle, for the iris, and for the anterior chamber parameters are all in the direction of being even more higher risk than Chinese for angle closure. And so they, again, compared to whites and narrow angles, thicker irises, everything smaller there, and they in fact had a greater lens vault. And even compared to the Chinese, it puts them at higher risk for angle closure, even with, and anecdotally, I would tell you that the Vietnamese patients that I see, and she sends some of them over for glaucoma surgery, as well as combined cataract and glaucoma surgery, have often very shallow chambers. They're often very challenging to do cataract surgery and even glaucoma surgery on. I'm going to delve a little bit even more high resolution, and we had a theory as to why, as we were getting higher resolution OCT, so you see this, what does this all show you? This shows you that angle that I was telling you about, but very high resolution. And so those two arrows are at what we would consider the trabecular meshwork, the beginning of the trabecular meshwork and the end. So very high magnification, high resolution. And we measured that distance with the thinking that, do Asians have a smaller area of the, or space for the fluid to filter through the trabecular meshwork? And we had different racial groups to look at. That didn't quite pan out. We found something maybe perhaps more interesting, at least for the US and on a more international level. So Caucasians had a certain length of 850 microns. They were the longest. Asians were very similar. There was no statistically significant at 843. Hispanics were a little bit lower, but not statistically significant. But the most interesting part was African Americans had the shortest trabecular meshwork. And why is that relevant? Well, if you have the area of your filtration is shortened, then you're going to have less filtration, maybe more glaucoma, more high pressure. And in fact, they do have the highest rates of glaucoma, of any race. The reason why we don't see the big numbers is because of, population differences between Asia and Africa and how long people live. But in terms of just sheer open-angle glaucoma, African Americans per capita have the most, and that could relate to the fact that they have less area for filtration. And so this is just a visual representation where you see Asians and Caucasians the longest length, and African Americans, you can tell, is just visually a shorter length, and Hispanics are somewhere in between. When you look at the statistics, African Americans are the only group statistically that were different from Asians and Caucasians in terms of that length of the trabecular meshwork. Of course, our future studies, which in a way we've already done with the data that our collaborative study with Chris, as well as one of our colleagues in Japan. And we have also in Caucasians, if we can look at that data and compare racially. Chris's group, who's been writing most of the papers, has been busy enough with just trying to use this data that we've collected with the CASIA OCT, three-dimensional high-resolution OCT of the angle, and looking at just predictive models for glaucoma, let alone looking at racial differences. But if somebody has the time, they can start using that data and looking at the racial differences in a three-dimensional way, in high-resolution way. I'm going to then move on to corneal thickness. This is a relatively short part that we looked at the corneal thicknesses of different racial groups. Again, I have that advantage. And is that different? Does it explain some of the glaucoma differences that we see? So here, I'll explain what these bars mean. This is about 550 is the average, corneal thickness. And those of you who, who are ophthalmologists know that this factor is very important in glaucoma. When we measure the pressure, we touch the cornea. And how thick it is tells us, whether we should adjust that pressure a little higher or lower. But I think the reason why this is related to glaucoma, as I'll show you later, is that the corneal thickness isn't just an artifact of the measurement, but it is also probably related to how much support. If your cornea is thin, as we see here with Japanese, and especially with African Americans, is the thinnest. Maybe you have less sort of structural support in the back of the eye, so there's been some correlation with that perhaps the lamina cribosa and your optic nerve has less support if in fact your cornea is thinner. So the relevance here for our talk about Asians is that Japanese Americans who have so much normal tension glaucoma have statistically thinner corneas than Chinese, as well as whites and Hispanics. The thinness in African Americans has been shown by many studies. That's been known for decades now, that African Americans have a thinner cornea, and that puts them at higher risk for glaucoma. But our finding in this study that we published was actually that Japanese also have thin corneas relative to other groups. May explain some of their normal tension glaucoma. And this is just showing a few of the papers that show the association of low corneal thickness with normal tension glaucoma. And again, that is probably why part of the reason why Japanese Americans have this higher rate of normal tension glaucoma. Now to the back of the eye and the optic disc size. And, you say, well, isn't it about the same in all different racial groups? Well, it isn't. And there's also a very big difference with the African-American population. That theme will come up again here, is that the optic disc size does seem to relate to glaucoma. And what we found, this is what we published, we did another study using optic disc photos in a way to correlate, but this is based on HRT. Similar technology to OCT, but it lets you measure the disc size. And the smallest disc, statistically smallest optic disc size was in Caucasians, and they also have the least amount of glaucoma. All the other groups were statistically higher than them, and Asians were somewhere in between in terms of African Americans, Hispanics who had a large optic disc, and Asians were a little bit in between. And that actually fits the demographics of or the statistics related to glaucoma. So these are US demographics compared to a study for the Asian population, the Singapore study. And they found, for example, in whites, which is the column all the way to the left here, you see that they have the least amount of open-angle glaucoma. And I've told you that before. They are the least at risk. African Americans are the highest risk. And you saw that in relation to their corneal thickness and their optic disc size. So there's correlation there. Hispanics are very close, and their numbers are also very close in terms of disc size to African Americans. And Asians are somewhere in between, at least for open-angle glaucoma. But I'm going to end with talking about myopia, which I think is going to really, unfortunately, really increase almost in an exponential way our amount of glaucoma that we develop over the many decades coming up. And so these are just some of the studies, some of the early studies that show the association of disc size with African race. And so that probably puts them at higher risk. And larger disc size is correlated with normal tension glaucoma as well. So you would think larger is better, but in this case, larger actually puts you at higher risk for glaucoma. And so that's a bad thing for Asians, which Asians have a larger disc size than Caucasians. And all of you should hopefully be very interested in this because, again, personally, you should be interested because you probably have myopia. And there's a real high chance that half of us in this room are glaucoma suspects just based on the fact that your myopia makes your disc, optic disc, look very at risk. Your disc is going to have some anatomical changes that put you at risk for glaucoma and perhaps even developing glaucoma. So this part you should be, and I am personally very interested in this because I am in the category of high myopia. I'm not necessarily proud of that, but unfortunately I am, and I am a glaucoma suspect as well. And as I said, many of you will maybe want your OCTs to see how your optic nerves look. We're going to touch on that a little bit. So is myopia associated with glaucoma? And the answer is yes. And how is it relevant to Asians? Well, the relevance to Asians is mostly the fact that there's so much myopia in Asians, not just all of you sitting in this room who are highly educated, but just if you go out into urban areas, you will find that there's a very high rate of myopia. And we'll end with talking about whether you can still have angle closure with myopia as well, the other disease Asians get. So this is just one of the many studies that have shown the correlation of myopia in the Asian race. This is from Taiwan. Actually, there's an updated study. There's many studies. There's the one from Beijing. There's also Singapore studies. So across many studies, most of them, and also in Japan as well as in Korea. When you look at urban areas, Seoul, Tokyo, Hong Kong, if you look at the younger population, and I consider all of you the younger population, is that about 90%, actually the updated study from Taiwan shows that high school seniors in Taiwan, 90% myopia. That's about everybody is wearing glasses or in contacts. And that 16% high myopia from 2 decades ago is now actually 25%. So it's actually increasing, and it's almost like everybody basically wears glasses or contacts, and a very large proportion of that is very highly myopic, such as myself. And in these studies, it's also shown to be a risk factor for developing glaucoma. And we also showed that, just the other aspect of it that leads to more normal tension glaucoma. Is there a lot of normal tension glaucoma among these Asian groups? Yeah, there is. Among the open angle glaucomas, we did a just sort of systemic review and meta-analysis among the population-based studies. This is Dr. Zhao, who came to us from Tongren Eye Hospital, and she's back there, so affiliated with them. She did this study with us, and we looked at all the studies from China. And about 70% of the glaucoma, open-angle glaucoma in Chinese, is normal tension. It hasn't been emphasized as much because we've been so focused in the ethnic Chinese population on angle closure. But when you look at the open-angle glaucoma, and when you go see patients, or in the future when you go see patients, their pressures are not necessarily going to be very high. You're going to have a high suspicion level for glaucoma, even if their pressures are in the normal range. This is a lower proportion when you look at the clinic setting. That may be due to the differences in the clinic setting. In the Tajimi study, we looked at this overall as well, is that the open-angle glaucoma prevalence was very high. But when you looked at that study, there may be a correlation with myopia because overall they had a myopic refraction. No surprise, again, as I told you, in Tokyo and the large cities, most people or a lot of people are very myopic, and that leads to a higher risk for normal tension glaucoma. We found this also in the Japanese American studies I had shown you before. And in the Kumajima study, which is a Japanese study, and I'm telling you about this one because this was done in the islands of, some of the smaller islands of Japan, including Okinawa. And the overall refraction in this group was emetropia. So now you have a lot more angle closure, than you did. It wasn't a minor disease. Now you have it as a very prevalent disease among this population because they're no longer mostly myopic. And then you also had a sort of lower percentage of normal tension glaucoma, maybe a reflection of the fact that there wasn't overall myopia in this group. The Beijing eye study, now this is showing not the myopia rates necessarily, but this is showing the correlation of myopia with glaucoma, just to prove to you that in fact, and there's many studies, but the Beijing eye study is one of the larger ones. I've circled these because when you look at optic disc criteria versus visual field criteria for glaucoma, being highly myopic like me puts me at risk about 6-fold. We're using either of those criteria compared to somebody emetropic. So I have a family history, I'm myopic, so I'm really, and I'm technically a glaucoma suspect because my optic discs look unusual. So, I'm a poster child in some ways for this risk that we're going to see more and more in the future, as almost all of those high school students that are myopic are now getting older, and once they get to a certain age, their glaucoma risk becomes higher. Now, is this risk just in the Chinese population or the Asian population if you have nearsightedness, as again most of you have? No, I don't think that it's necessarily that Chinese who have myopia are at risk. This is a study from the Blue Mountains Eye Study. So this is from Australia, in which there was a white population that they looked at in the Blue Mountains area. And they also had an association of myopia with glaucoma. So those circled values are 2 to 3 times, 2-3-fold of glaucoma as you get greater myopia. So that's also shown in the white population. The problem is that in the Asian population, almost everybody is myopic. We also looked at this in the U.S. population. We wanted to see, was there association with glaucoma in the U.S. population? So we used a large population-based database. Mary Chu's now faculty over in Chicago, a glaucoma specialist as well. So I'm very proud. She's now a very prominent glaucoma specialist, and she worked with me when she was a medical student. And in this study, what we found was using visual field criteria that if you were more myopic, so as you go to the right, you went from emetropia to mild myopia, moderate myopia, severe myopia, you can see the increasing rates of severe, moderate, and early visual field defects consistent with glaucoma. So I'm in that worst category of severe myopia, so my risk for developing glaucoma is the highest in this picture. Why is this? For those of you who wonder, well, why is it that being nearsighted causes me to have more chance of glaucoma, or what happens to my optic disc? And the Koreans, who have a lot of myopia as well, normal tension glaucoma, did this wonderful study and follow-up studies as well, looking at what happened. So this is probably what happened to us as children, is that we had a relatively normal round-looking disc. And then as we became more myopic, so this is a prospective study, I think starting at 7, then they went all the way to 12 and maybe beyond. And you can tell, and so when we judge the disc, if you're an ophthalmologist, when you're looking at that disc, I'm sorry, my arrow doesn't show it here, but as you look from the left to the right and you're developing more myopia, that disc develops as atrophy at the side because you're getting a separation of the basement membrane and the RPE away from the optic disc edge. And actually the real edge, if you follow those vessels, are actually at that edge all the way to the edge of the atrophy. And so when we judge an optic disc, let's say on the right side, and we judge it and we say, oh, it's a certain cup to disc ratio, we're actually in a way off because the disc actually goes all the way out to those arrows as you see there. I'm going to show you that in these pictures there. It also happens not only temporally on that side, but also nasally, is that as those vessels get pulled, they also then get hidden by underneath the disc as that disc is getting, or the optic nerve is getting pulled from our long eyeballs. And so you see on the OCT down below that arrow is showing where that RP, that sort of previous edge, is no longer the edge of the optic disc. It's been pulled all the way, and this area that you have in between is relatively weak. And so that's probably why anatomically we're more likely to develop glaucoma. We've taken a normal optic disc, we've stretched the eye out in the optic nerve, and the disc gets stretched out so that we have an area of weakness. We have a handicap, basically. Not all of us will develop glaucoma, but we're at higher risk, as you say. Basically, almost all of you sit in this room, compared to somebody who's not wearing glasses, doesn't need glasses, you are somewhere between 3 to 6 times higher risk of developing glaucoma. And here's just visually a schematic showing that area that was the open, where the retina was connected to the optic disc is getting it pulled apart because we become this nearsighted. And so you see those two dots moving, separating, and you have this area of weakness that's unsupported. Chris is really I would say probably the world leader at looking at myopia with OCT and other aspects, but certainly with the OCT. And he's always been an expert at using OCT and looking at the OCT algorithm for detecting glaucoma, but particularly, and again, being in Hong Kong, I'm sure you have a lot of myopes, so you have that population, and you also have the motivation to study the role of myopia in glaucoma. So this is just one of his early papers, and I just wanted to show it because it helps us in our understanding here too, is if we use a normal OCT scan, right, to go in the office, you get the scan, see if you have glaucoma. Well, it's based on the databases for people who have a normal length eye. I mean, they will adjust for your age and your gender, but they don't really adjust normally, for myopia, because your optic nerves, chances are, at least 50% yours look like mine. And we're going to see a picture of that in a minute. So he's taken and he's improved that database with a myopic database so that it improves the specificity, because there's a lot of overcalling of glaucoma and in a way, oversensitivity about detecting glaucoma. And so he's improved the specificity and kept the sensitivity the same. We don't need higher sensitivity because it's already oversensitive for glaucoma and overcalling it. So improving the specificity is very helpful. And you can see how in the same eye, when you look at the top versus the bottom, in an eye that's normal, and that's probably me at the top there, in normal database, I have actual defects in some segments of my OCT. If you're wondering how to read this, green is good, yellow is borderline, and red is bad. So this is sometimes called red disease, where they don't really have glaucoma, but it's a disease based on the fact that there's redness there. And when you have Chris's optimized database, then you can really understand that maybe this person really doesn't have glaucoma in that healthy eye. And then somebody who has glaucoma, you're not changing the sensitivity. You're still able to detect it, but again, with a better database. And you see the atrophy around both optic nerves in people with myopia. I'm going to end with talking about putting the two sides together a little bit. If you have myopia, you would think with the longer eye, all that space would increase and you would not have that problem I told you about in the beginning where everything's crowded in the Chinese eye and causes more angle closure, or the Asian eye. And so does that take away our risk for developing angle closure? Unfortunately not. This is a study from our colleagues in Singapore, where they looked at ethnic Chinese or Asians, and they looked at whether they develop angle closure glaucoma too, or angle closure. The answer is still yes. So in their clinic population, if you're a myope, you still were a large proportion of their angle closure. So even in my case, I could still develop angle closure glaucoma. You would think I would have some benefit. And in fact, among the myopia patients, a lot of them were, moderate or severe myopia like myself, who could still develop this angle closure. Here's just a picture schematic from the paper showing the reason why. So when we elongate our eyes, so you guys and myself have football-shaped eyes. Normally it's like a basketball, right? It's round. But we actually have long eyeballs, and you would think that would help everything, stretches everything out. Unfortunately, that elongation is vitreous elongation. So that front part, all those lines that you see at the top there, show that everything in the front stays about the same. The reason my eye is so long and your eye is so long is because in that middle, that vitreous elongates. But unfortunately, the front of the eye stays the same. So we retain that risk for angle closure. So unfortunately, we can't seem to catch a break as an Asian. We still have angle closure risk even with the long eye, and then we have a higher risk for normal tension glaucoma with our long eye. So in summary, yes, we, unfortunately, I say we as an Asian population, have more angle closure glaucoma, normal tension glaucoma, and it's probably only going to increase, maybe even exponentially, as we start seeing all these high myopes like myself come through the system and get older, because this is an age-related disease. And the reason for all of these higher risks, I think I would argue, is almost all anatomical. Our eyes are anatomically and therefore in a way genetically smaller at the front than whites, or even our dynamics of how our iris behaves is different from whites and causes us to have angle closure glaucoma. Among Japanese, they have a thinner cornea, which I think puts them for such a high risk. They are the penultimate of normal tension glaucoma. Almost all of their glaucoma is normal tension. That could be partly explained by this. And our larger optic disc, the larger is not, bigger is not better here. So unfortunately, that puts us at higher risk. And I think the biggest issue that all of you are going to see in the future is the myopia that's coming through and causing all this epidemic of glaucoma. Thanks, everybody, and I hope we have a good discussion.
So we thank Professor Lin for his very inspiring talk, and I believe it is also of particular relevance to what we're doing here, because not many places in the world right now are having population-based study, and we just finished our 4 or 5 years of collection data from population-based area in Southern District, and we are also adding additional data from other regions recently in our collaboration with ARBIS using OCT to screen glaucoma. So the data we haven't published, and we are still organizing the data set. That would be a data set composing of more than 10,000 population-based subjects. So that data set, we also have anterior segment OCT, we have posterior segment OCT. That would really give us new insights into what's going on into the eye, how, not just for glaucoma, but for also other eye diseases, how the anatomy of the eye would be related to the development of pathologies that we heard from what Professor Lin shared. Just a question regarding one interesting aspect you pointed out earlier is that the Chinese eyes, we have smaller anterior chamber width as well as smaller anterior chamber depth. And that actually suggests that the lens iris diaphragm is actually more anteriorly located, which you pointed out earlier. But what we haven't seen that much is, at least in the studies that you quoted, the axial length. Now, obviously, some of this data, you also, I believe you have the axial length data, but can you also share with us when we compare the Caucasian eyes, the Chinese eyes, the Asian eyes, what are the differences in terms of their axial length?
That's a good question. We published these so long ago, I can't give you the specifics, but I do know in general that when we collected our US data, for example, it wasn't very shifted highly myopic, and we adjusted for axial length so that those differences that you see are adjusted for axial length. So what I mean by that is when we compared a white person and a Chinese person, it would be, for the statistics at least, it would be the same axial length that we're considering, and then everything about the Chinese eye is a smaller and narrower and thicker iris. But we didn't have a very high proportion of very myopic eyes. It wasn't like 90% as we see in the high school students, for example. And the reason why is because, well, we did these studies about a couple decades ago, and also what I'm telling you about this sort of impending wave of myopic normal tension glaucoma is impending. These patients that we recruited were, I think we had the minimum age of 40. Most of them were around 60s. And so in that population, especially in San Francisco, it was mostly some people who lived there many decades and, were not necessarily engineers and they were patients who came to our clinic. This was a general ophthalmology clinic. And so we didn't have necessarily that skew towards myopia, which could actually skew our data as well if it was like all myopia and, judging their angles and looking at that. But no, it was fairly balanced, I think, across the different groups as well. Yeah.
How about the parameters among Asians? Because what you show, you have a beautiful collection of data from different ethnicities, and what we learn is you have differences between the Caucasian eyes compared with the Asians. But among Asians, do you have any idea whether the Chinese eye is actually at high risk compared with the other ethnic groups?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, Chris, because as I like to say when I give this talk in some version in the U.S., because I gave you a lot of data, but bottom line data was that Asians in general are more at risk, right? The iris is thicker, the anterior chamber is smaller, the angle is smaller in Asians, but there are differences. And the reason that the joke I make when I'm in the U.S. is that, we may all look alike, but we're not all alike. We're different among different Asian groups. And some of the differences are that, for example, the Korean population had a difference, some of the differences were, and the Japanese, as well as the Filipinos, tended to have a smaller lens vault than the Chinese population. So we didn't have necessarily an exaggerated lens vault that puts us at severe risk compared to whites, but having that as a benefit may explain why the ethnic Chinese population is like the prototype population. We talk about that population when we think of angle closure glaucoma. Although it still exists in the other ones, not as much though, but then we also have a variation on that as well. In the Vietnamese population, they almost all their values were statistically significant compared to Chinese, but in the opposite, wrong direction. They actually even had higher risk. And so our sort of clinic-based population study showing almost half of their glaucoma is angle closure glaucoma fits that as well. So it's a good explanation for that. And anecdotally, when I have surgery in my patients with Vietnamese descent, it's very challenging. That small anterior chamber, some of them, it's almost like no space. You have to do all these different things to try to, increase that space and let me ask the question the other way too. Do you see here in Hong Kong, I'm sure among the older population, there's still a lot of angle closure. All this myopia is going to be this generation when, 20 years from now when we do their cataract surgery and there's going to be more space. Do you have commonly that challenge?
Is Phoebe around? Phoebe's not around. Okay, Phoebe's here. So Phoebe actually is working using our population-based data, looking into how anterior we're using anterior segmental CT, the Cassier, to look at 360 degrees of the eyes. We are using the ITC definition, the study we did together, to look at angle closure. Maybe she can share with us about the prevalence of angle closure and the different types of primary angle closure disease.
Hello, Professor Lin and Hi. Professor Larry. So yeah, basically we analyzed part of the population. So we did a pilot study, and we're still compiling other data. But what I remember from the study is that 1 in 10 out of up to 1 in 10 individuals in Hong Kong actually have anatomically narrow angles. So they have ITC more than 180 degrees in at least one of their eyes. Yeah, and then the prevalence of PACG was around I think 0.05%, the prevalence around that. Yeah, but then what was interesting in the study was that among those PACG patients, actually most of them, like over 60 to 70% of them actually had normal tension. Yeah, and that's the figure that I remember for now. But we're still working on it, and I think we'll present it in World. I think we'll present it in ARVO later. If I don't know if you will be there, and we will give you more updated numbers.
That ARVO abstract, it was accepted for presentation?
Yeah, it's accepted, yes.
So it will be at the ARVO meeting. So I think interesting part here is just to supplement what Phoebe mentioned. We have a population, we're looking at individuals more than 50 years of age, and we're randomly recruiting these subjects to ask them to come back to our clinic. Many of them have gonioscopy. We also have anterior segmental CT, imaging of the retinal nerve fiber out in the head. And what Phoebe just shared is that we have actually pretty large proportion of patients having iris trabecular contact for more than 180 degrees. So this is kind of a definition we use in the clinic to diagnose patients with angle closure. So surprisingly, not many of them, actually very few of them, had glaucoma. What is even more interesting, which is also alluded in your talk, is we do have a very high proportion of patients with normal tension, meaning that they have intraocular pressure below 21 millimeter mercury. And that actually echoed very well to the study that your fellow did with you. About having 70% of POAG patients in China, Chinese patients, they have normal tension. And in our study, we haven't published the data yet, but what we found is that 90% actually of these POAG individuals, they had pressure below 21. So this is a little bit surprising because I used to think Japan, Korea, the regions where we have most NTG patients, but it turned out that even Chinese, it just we need to look at our data very carefully, and that's why I think this data set is tremendously important. I just want you, the research team here, to recognize that how important the work you are doing, the data we're getting, how valuable that we have such data set in order to address some questions that we will not be able to see in the literature. Helen recently joined our team. She previously worked in the Chinese Institute of Hong Kong, and she is studying myopia. Maybe she can also, she's working in our population-based study. Maybe she can share with us your insights about the prevalence of myopia in Hong Kong, and some of the images Professor Lin shared, the elongation of the eye leading to the tilting of the disc, stretching of the retinal nerve fibrillary. I think that would be a kind of a very interesting project that we can look into in the upcoming children cohort that we're going to collect. I would love to see how, using perhaps rotor, to see how this nerve changes, how these axonal fiber bundles change over time in these children. Helen, you have something that you would like to share?
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. And for myopia, it's highly related to glaucoma. And in our previous work, we did some optic disc about in children, about gamma zone or data zone in myopia eyes. But I think in the future we can focus on the gamma zone or data zone in adults, glaucoma or normal patients. So I may ask, seek your advice for this research.
Let me understand your question. Is that you have people you're prospectively going to study for risk of glaucoma? Is that your question? I want to make sure I understand.
Yeah, we have just Professor Liang mentioned we have a population-based study. We collected the data for 5 years, and among this, about 20,000 adults aged 50 years and above, and we found about 3,000 high myopia patients. So now we are grade the high myopia patient for their fundus photo and for the because all the patient has the OCT examination. So we also to investigate the atrophy, the PPA of the adults. So I would like to seek your advice about the research, the future research about this PPA.
Yeah, there's a lot of research about the peripapillary atrophy. There's the alpha zone, the beta zone as well. And of course, most of the changes that I was showing that were in the children, right? So that's obvious from a normal disc. Basically, when they're 7, as they're growing myopia, that will change dramatically. It's generally believed that it mostly stays stable after a certain age, probably when you become adulthood, probably around 18, 20. So if your patients are all adults, I don't know, it will not change that dramatically as you saw in the pictures. But it would be very interesting to see in a population that is going to become, almost all myopic or from the younger generations, how that changes over time. You have all that data, right? And so you can analyze the alpha zone and beta zone. There's a lot of research, obviously, mostly from the Korean population now, the Korean associates, looking at all these different factors about the alpha and beta zone and the direction and torsion of the optic nerve. So you can look at some of those papers and predicting the visual field defects as well as the risk for developing glaucoma. And there's a lot that goes into that detail. You guys are really going to be the experts at that. Again, the Koreans have so much normal tension. They published a lot on that. But I'm glad you have that database. I have a couple questions to follow up on this database that I want to make sure. I think, Phoebe, you mentioned that there was among the closed angle closure glaucoma that developed, or it's very small, like 0.05%, which sounds relatively small. But a lot of those were normal tension glaucoma, right? Is that what you're going to be presenting partly at ARVO? Is that a lot of those angle closure was normal tension?
Yes.
I have an explanation for that. That is not my unique explanation, but a lot of what we consider normal tension glaucoma is undiagnosed angle closure type of glaucoma. And it can still be normal tension because part of the angle may be closed, so you're at risk, but you will have intermittent closure, particularly, let's say, at night. And then it'll close and the pressure will go up to 30 or 35 or maybe even significantly higher. And they may not be high that it's an acute angle closure attack. Those are actually relatively rare. But that high pressure overnight, let's say, or in the evening hours, causes more damage to the nerve. But when they come to your office at 8 o'clock in the morning, their pressures are normal, or during the regular day. And that's a long time standing theory that a lot of that. So that could go into your discussion or your explanation. And you probably already thought of that. But that, I guess, doesn't surprise me too much that there's so much normal tension among what we consider angle closure glaucoma. Because it should be high pressure, right? Angle closes off, the pressure goes high. But there's so much we don't understand about angle closure glaucoma still as well. And I had a question for you, Chris, when you were describing the population that you have in general, that you surprise even me. You go beyond even the 70%, which is surprising to us that, we're approaching the levels, again, stereotypically, we talk about the Japanese with 90% of their glaucoma, open angle glaucoma is normal tension glaucoma, and then there was Koreans with their population studies, 85% of their, but you're also showing similarly, how much of that interaction is with myopia, is my question. Is it because there's so much myopia in that group?
Actually, the question should be back to you. But I think what Helen mentioned earlier is we do have pretty high proportions of patients having myopia here. She mentioned about 30%?
3,000 high myopia.
3,000 myopia. That would be 3,000 over 20,000.
Yeah.
Right. So we have actually population-based data of more than 10,000. But we also, because before I joined the department, that study was a volunteer-based type of equipment. So we didn't have population-based data.
Okay.
So we have 10,000 for that. So we wouldn't be able to get a good estimate about the prevalence if it is over 20,000. But the fact is, I think the challenge which we're facing is perhaps the question is about how are we able then to tell whether perhaps some of the damages we see at the optic nerve actually is progressive, or is it truly glaucoma type of change, or is it related to myopia? Actually, this is, I believe, based on an earlier study from Stanford, Kodev Singh, which he followed, not many, pretty small series of myopic patients, most of them are Chinese, I believe, and then they followed them for more than 10 years and they didn't see any change over time. And the argument, which also is related to what you just shared with us, is when the eyeball grows, the axial length increases and then it stretches the nerve fiber layer, and that obviously would induce some damage. As I said, I would love to see how this eyeball changes, how the anatomical changes would lead to damage of the nerve. But if that's the case, when the eye lengthening stops, then we will expect the condition stabilize. So what's your thought on that, and how, I mean, I'm sure you have a lot of insights into it.
That's a fundamental question going forward. I think probably the most important part of my talk, besides the corneal thickness, the anterior chamber, all that, for the future, it's the myopia part, which is again structural, anatomic. That's the future of not just for Hong Kong, for Taiwan and Taipei, where almost everybody's, young people are nearsighted, and maybe for the rest of the world as we're spending less time outdoors. Before I answer your question, I actually want to make sure all the young people understand, what's the cause of myopia, right? Is it genetic? Are both your parents very nearsighted, and that's why you're very nearsighted? Genetics is only about 20% of the equation, Almost all of it is due to environmental reasons. Why do ethnic Chinese have so much myopia? It's because we didn't spend time outdoors. That's pretty well established now. It used to be the thought that you spent so much time up close. But that is maybe a factor, but a lesser factor than the fact that you're not spending a normal time outdoors. In the old days, so to speak, you would work on a farm, and even if you went to school, you come back and you go outside and play, and so it's a lack of sunlight exposure, directly sunlight exposure during those formative years, 7 to 12 years old. So anyway, I just want to make sure the young people understood that. That is now very well established. So unfortunately, all of you probably spent all your time indoors studying. That's why you're here and your high achievement. But to answer your question, that's a very fundamental issue going forward, maybe the most important one going forward. First of all, is it glaucoma, right? We have all these high myopes, and if you, again, believe the studies from Taiwan and maybe your own studies in your school-age population here, probably most of the people, I would guess at least most of the children, if not almost 90%, are myopic. And what are we going to do with those people who look like they have glaucoma? So not all of them are going to be glaucoma, obviously. A larger risk, as I showed, but a lot of them are going to be, maybe more of them are going to actually be in that glaucoma suspect category. I'm in that category. And as I said, I venture to say that half of you, if you got an OCT, at least the one without Chris's adjustment for the myopic database, will look like you have an abnormal optic nerve and maybe glaucoma. What do you do with that population? And in general, for that population that only has optic nerve changes that we're not sure and is normal pressure, no family history, I would follow them, right? There are glaucoma suspects. And so that's why having that, 5 years or 10 years, 8 years, 10 years will be helpful to really understand what happens and who's at risk. So that's just some clinical answers to your question. What happens to that optic nerve? And is it really glaucoma too, if it changes? The population that Chris was talking about is that, that paper came out, almost 15, 20 years ago. Interesting study because it was cherry-picked, right? It wasn't a population study. It's just he's noticed this happened in specifically middle-aged Chinese males in the Stanford, near the Stanford area. And his point was that not all of it's glaucoma. They were being treated for glaucoma. It was his patients. They were being treated for glaucoma because they also have visual field defects. And his point was that some of them probably don't have glaucoma. Over 10 years, their visual fields did not change. Even though they were treated, you would expect people to progress. And that also exists in our cohort, and that's probably the biggest group that's difficult to understand and determine whether we should treat them. I will tell you, you're asking me, well, what do I do? In reality, I have a lot of these patients, they have these myopic-looking discs, and it looks like glaucoma, and they have these visual field defects, which could be due to just their myopic, right? Their myopic changes to their retina. I still treat them. And I'm being maybe over-conservative. I wouldn't do surgery on them, but I might do SLT. I might do 1 drop or 2 drops. And of course, determining whether they go on to surgery would be if they progressed. Well, if they progressed, by definition, they have glaucoma. So that's really the hard part, is when you first see that patient and they look like they have glaucoma. Some of you may be in here who have visual field defects. May not be very severe, but just having that damaged looking optic nerve, some of you will statistically in this room have visual field defects, and do we treat you as if you have glaucoma? And you know, at least a small study I remember from Singapore, I think Tian was associated, there weren't any demographic data that really helped us to understand, like, were men more likely to actually go on to develop glaucoma if they have this appearance with a visual field defect, or, you know, this sort of borderline glaucoma and myopic versus women versus age, unfortunately. And so I think that's maybe where you can also get some help from this larger database you have. Who are the people who are really going to get that glaucoma in that group? Or maybe are there OCT angiography predictors? I don't know if you got OCTA in these patients. The demographic ones will probably not help you too much, men versus women, age or something. But if you have OCT data or even angiography data, or if you do more specific analysis of their optic nerves, are there certain types of tilt and torsion, as the Korean studies we're looking at, you know, that give certain visual field defects? Are those going to be more likely to be associated with really developing glaucoma later on? So that's what's good about this sort of prospective study that you have going.
I mean, people invest their career studying glaucoma because it is a very, very important disease. First of all, it's very common. By the way, we haven't shared with you that the recent analysis we got from a population-based study, we noticed that actually 8% of our Hong Kong population over 50 years had glaucoma. Isn't it surprising? I find actually pretty unbelievable, because I don't think anywhere has reported prevalence of glaucoma more than, 4%.
Yeah.
And this is something that's so unusual, but this is what we see. We're looking at it, we are checking it carefully. There are many people in this room help looking at the fundus picture, looking at the OCT pictures. So this is pretty an important finding. So it's common. At the same time, it is also challenging to look at how the disease affects patients. It's challenging because very often we see progression happening in one eye only, and then this worsening because it takes so long, often in years, that patients develop adjustments and they may not be able to aware that the disease is already affecting their visual performance, but they just had no idea. So this is why it is critical to identify new ways that we can identify, first of all, who are at risk of getting worse, and then identify who are fast progressors. Because even though for the study I mentioned, the study from Stanford, even though they had more than 10 years of follow-up having no evidence of visual field loss, doesn't mean that they don't have progression. We identify the limitation of visual field. We identify, there are better ways that we can detect change. And there are also measures that we miss, during our routine clinical assessment. Measures like depth perception, color vision. There are other dimensions of the visual function that we don't routinely test in the clinic. So patient may develop disability in these areas. Doesn't necessarily that they will show up, worsening the visual field. Any questions from our audience? Yes, please.
Sorry, can I correct myself? So for the figure that I quoted for PACG, I mixed it up with another thing. So the prevalence was at 0.4%. Yeah. So, and also the prevalence for PAC was 0.5%. And actually, can I just echo with Professor Lin's hypothesis on why those close angle glaucomas might be normal tension. So I agree that, I also heard about that hypothesis on intermittent angle closure. And I think recently I also heard about another hypothesis that's increase in choroid thickness. So may I know your thoughts on this hypothesis, like whether it also explains the normal tension in angle closure glaucoma. And also, I think my second question is if you treat those patients with myopic discs, however, their OCT, if their OCT and visual field all remain stable for, let's say, 3 years, then do you discuss with the patient on whether to withhold the treatment, like stop it and observe, or should we still continue to treat according to their risk factors? Thank you very much.
Okay. Yeah, a lot of questions, but let me see if I remember all of them. So to address the sort of the different mechanisms for angle closure, as you were saying, you updated that data, and it seems relatively small. Let me comment on that. You say 0.4% and versus 0.5% for PAC, and maybe some of that reflects kind of things I was telling you about. As we get to more myopization of the population, we're seeing more normal tension glaucoma, right? 90% of it is normal tension, and more open angle glaucoma. So we are shifting towards that. Even though I told you we're still at risk, all of you who are myopes, which is everybody and me, we're still at risk for angle closure. It's lessened. It definitely is lessened by being myope. So my anterior chamber, somebody's looked at it, is very deep, so I probably am at no risk. And if I were a hyperope or emmetrope, I'd be higher risk. So I think that's why you're seeing less. And then your question was, what are some of the mechanisms? This is very interesting. I just talked about the angle, but as you said, they have a thicker choroid. There's also studies, especially from the Japanese, that they see this sort of suprachoroidal fluid when they do UBM. So I don't know if you're doing UBMs in some of your studies, but that's been of controversy. It's very hard to do UBMs in like 1,000 people. So they usually have small numbers, or they look at the contralateral eye of an eye that has an acute attack, and they find the contralateral eye also has this sort of suprachoroidal fluid, which might shift everything more forward and make the angle. Is that a cause or a major factor? And it may be, we don't know. They just have small studies about that, and the choroid is thicker too. So those are all different. You bring up interesting different factors besides just looking at the angle. That's the ultimate factor. We also don't have population-based data. Again, you see from my studies, I like to compare to, let's say, Caucasians or other groups that don't have it, so we won't necessarily have it unless we have. Let me ask this question. In Hong Kong, is there a fair Caucasian population you could do a comparative study? My guess is not.
Not now,
Okay.
perhaps.
Yeah.
We do have a good Filipino population.
Yeah.
We do have perhaps a good Southeast Asian population,
Yeah.
but not so many Caucasians in Hong Kong nowadays.
Yeah, not in your clinics at least. I see visitors, but I mean, they're temporarily here, so on vacation. Did I miss one of your questions, Phoebe? I forget all of your questions.
Yes, thank you. And my second question is whether you would withhold treatment for those patients with myopic disc, but with no progression along the years on VF and OCT.
That's a little bit like what Chris was saying with Kuldev Singh's study at Stanford, which is, he wanted to make a point that he observed, he cherry-picked these, I think, about 30 patients. So it wasn't a large study where he found that, oh, yeah, over 10 years, the visual fields stay the same. So maybe it's not really due to glaucoma. Will I stop it? Well, I have done that, but rarely, because even in Dr. Singh's population, which he's trying to make a point that maybe they don't have glaucoma. I was treating them unnecessarily, but maybe his treatment actually prevented their visual fields from getting worse too. So I guess I'm just being the conservative doctor that I am, and we don't have the right answers, right? That's what's maybe going to come out from your population studies, is if it is glaucoma, unfortunately, a lot of it is some of it is paracentral, and some of it is very severe and getting toward the center. So I'm a little bit worried that if I stop the medications and they progress, it's a very slippery slope. As a doctor who's been doing this for, seeing glaucoma patients for now almost 25, 30 years, knowing that people can go blind, especially as it gets closer to the center. But every case is different, of course, right? So if it's very peripheral, and maybe some of it even looks like it goes away as they do a better visual field test, it actually looks better. Those are the people I particularly may stop the medication. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe it's not really glaucoma. But it's very individualistic. I'm sorry we don't have the data. We talk about these studies where a colleague cherry picks, 30 patients out of his clinic. So we really need this kind of larger based study. Maybe we'll have more technical ways, like from your OCT data, or maybe OCT angiography or whatever other studies. In the future, we hope to actually also have, about this too, is that we also hope to have non-invasive ways using OCT or maybe HRT to image particular factors that are associated with apoptosis of retinal ganglion cells. And they've done that in a research setting, showing that, that predicts the visual field loss that you will have in the future. So we could have those kind of things that detect annexin 6 and other factors, or NAD levels in the retina, but in a real time and in a clinical setting. Of course, that's in the future if we have it.
So, do we have any further questions? Thank you so much for staying very late in this evening. Some of you actually went to our commission training back here to listen to Professor Lin's talk. Thank you very much. Before we finish, let me present a small gift to our guest.